Historians still debate what really happened on the coldest night of the Middle Ages, but everyone agrees it changed how humans slept, survived, and lived forever. They said winter was simply a part of life in medieval Europe, but no one was prepared for the winter of 1317, the one villagers later called the night the cold became the enemy. It began like any other December evening. The sun dropped early, the wind whispered through the fields, and families hurried indoors before darkness swallowed the roads. But by the time the moon rose, something had changed. Temperatures fell with a violence no one alive had ever felt. It was as if the sky itself had cracked open and spilled ice onto the world. In a small wooden village, tucked between two frozen rivers, a family of 5 huddled in their one-room cottage. The walls were thin, built from logs sealed with nothing more than mud and straw. A fireplace glowed in the corner, but its warmth barely reached the far wall. The father, a farmer hardened by years of frost-bitten mornings, leaned close to the flames and frowned. "The fire isn't taking," he muttered. It didn't make sense. He had packed the wood tight, the ember bed was glowing red, yet the heat seemed to vanish the second it rose. Outside, the wind turned vicious. Not a gentle wind that sweeps snow across a field. This one howled like a wounded animal, sharp and relentless. It squeezed through every crack in the cottage, beneath the door, around the window frame, even between the floorboards. The children flinched every time a gust rattled the walls. Across Europe, from the stone castles of France to the farmsteads of England, people experienced the same terrifying thing. Their homes were suddenly useless against the cold. Stone, which normally trapped heat, became a refrigerator. Roofs groaned from the weight of sudden ice. Water froze inside buckets, even when placed beside the hearth. Chimneys clogged with frost as fast as families could clear them. Chroniclers later wrote that birds froze mid-flight and fell to the ground like stones. Whether that detail is true or not, it captured the atmosphere of that night, a cold so ruthless it became a living force. But the strangest part? Nobody expected it. Medieval people understood winter, of course. They had lived through dozens of them. They knew how to gather firewood, how to thicken door frames with cloth, how to seal windows with animal hides. But this cold was different. It didn't simply chill the skin, it pressed into the bones. Even entire forests seemed to crack under the temperature drop. Some villages later claimed the cold was a punishment for poor harvests. Others blamed wandering spirits or the wrath of saints. But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Europe was slipping into what we now call the Little Ice Age, a period of brutally unpredictable winters. And this particular night was the first time people realized something had fundamentally changed. Back in the small village cottage, the mother wrapped the youngest child in wool, but it wasn't helping. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the numbing cold creeping into her fingertips. She glanced at her husband. "We've never had a night like this." He nodded. "The fire should be warming the whole room. But it isn't." He wasn't wrong. The air inside the home behaved strangely. Cold drafts moved like invisible rivers, slipping across the floor and pooling in the corners. Anyone standing near the walls felt a painful sting, as if touching ice. People later remembered this night as the first time they learned a terrible truth. Cold doesn't just arrive. It invades. In many parts of Europe, people made desperate choices. Some abandoned their homes entirely, opting to gather inside the village church, one of the few structures large enough to hold a roaring communal fire. In other places, families broke long-held customs and invited neighbors or distant cousins inside to share warmth. Social boundaries blurred, rank, wealth, and reputation briefly stopped mattering. Heat became the only currency that counted. Like a slow-moving disaster, the frozen night swept through the continent. And in the midst of the panic, something remarkable happened, something historians rarely highlight. Medieval people, though frightened, were inventive. They had no central heating, no insulation, and no scientific understanding of temperature. But they did have instinct, observation, and a fierce determination to live. In the little cottage by the twin rivers, the farmer's wife noticed something. When all 5 family members sat close together near the hearth, even without touching, the cold seemed to soften. Their shared breath warmed the space around them. "It's warmer here," she whispered. The father frowned again, confused. But as he moved his children closer and wrapped their arms around each other, he felt it too. The strange power of shared warmth. It was a tiny discovery, a simple moment, but it would ripple outward in ways nobody could imagine. That night wasn't just a crisis, it was a turning point, a moment when cold forced innovation, a moment when survival demanded creativity, and a moment when medieval Europe unknowingly set the stage for a sleeping revolution. Because what families did that frozen night would soon spread across villages, towns, and even royal courts. And in the next chapter, you'll see why fire, despite all its power, failed medieval people when they needed it most. If you asked a medieval villager what stood between life and death on a winter night, the answer would have been simple. Fire. Fire was warmth. Fire was safety. Fire was the heart of the home. But on the frozen night of 1317, something unimaginable happened. Fire failed. Not because people lacked wood, not because the flames went out, but because the cold was stronger than the heat. To understand the terror that swept through medieval households, you have to understand how their fireplaces actually worked. We imagine big stone hearths with flames licking high into the chimney, but most medieval homes had tiny fire pits, barely large enough to heat a pot of stew. And unlike modern fireplaces that funnel smoke upward, medieval hearths often filled entire rooms with smoke before reluctantly letting it escape through a hole in the roof. It was messy, inefficient, and dangerously unpredictable. On a normal winter night, a small fire could take the edge off the cold. People sat close, children nearly touching the embers, and the warmth spread. Slowly, unevenly, but enough to survive. But on that night, everything changed. Villagers later described it the same way. No matter how close we sat, there was no warmth. The flames were bright, but the heat was gone. It was as if the fire had turned cold. Of course, the fire hadn't actually turned cold, but the wind had turned deadly. As temperatures plummeted, icy drafts raced through medieval homes like invisible knives. Medieval houses had no insulation, only gaps, cracks, loose boards, and walls that leaked cold like river water through a sieve. The wind didn't just cool the air, it sucked heat straight out of the fireplace, scattering warmth before it had a chance to spread. Even large manor houses weren't safe. Their tall ceilings trapped heat far above head level. Their stone walls absorbed warmth faster than the fire could produce it. Castles became giant freezers, cold, echoing stone chambers where fire barely made a dent. To make matters worse, medieval chimneys often weren't lined or sealed. In extreme cold, frost built inside them, constricting the airflow. Smoke rose slower, flames struggled. Some fires simply smothered themselves. Imagine sitting in your home, watching the fire blaze as brightly as ever, yet feeling nothing. No warmth, no relief, just cold tightening around you like a fist. For the people of 1317, this wasn't just uncomfortable. It was terrifying. Many families burned through their firewood piles in hours. Wood that was meant to last weeks vanished in a single night. And still, the temperature inside their homes barely rose. In one countryside manor, a servant recorded that the lord of the house ordered every door and window barred, covered with cloth, plugged with straw, even nailed shut. Yet even then, the servants claimed the wind crept in like a ghost, swirling around their ankles and stinging their cheeks. In a small village not far from York, an elderly monk later wrote that he saw families dragging furniture closer to the hearth, stools, benches, even entire beds, trying to trap the heat. But the heat kept slipping away. Fire, the one thing medieval people trusted more than anything, suddenly became unreliable. But the cold wasn't done yet. Animals began to react. Sheep and chickens huddled together in strange piles. Dogs refused to leave the hearth. Cows in the barn mooed anxiously, restless and confused. Medieval people believed animals sensed things humans could not: storms, spirits, danger. That night, animals sensed the truth. The cold wasn't a season anymore. It was a threat. Out in the forests, the situation was even worse. Woodsmen who ventured out to chop emergency firewood returned with frostbitten fingers. Their axes cracked against frozen trees. The sap inside trunks had hardened, making them splinter unpredictably. Some trees were so cold they rang like metal when struck. Firewood, the very fuel of survival, became harder to gather and harder to burn. Damp wood smoked instead of heating. Hard wood burned too fast. And the fire that did survive couldn't outpace the cold streaming through every gap in the walls. The panic that spread across Europe that night wasn't loud or dramatic. Medieval people were used to hardship. They didn't scream or run into the streets. Instead, a quiet, heavy fear settled over homes. Parents wrapped their children in wool and held them close. Neighbors knocked on doors looking for help. Churches rang bells long after midnight, calling villagers to huddle together around communal fires. And still, it wasn't enough. Some historians later argued that this night marked the first time medieval communities realized their architecture. Homes, hearths, walls, roofs were not built for extreme cold. The design that had served generations was suddenly obsolete. But others saw something else happen, something far more human. As fire failed, people turned toward each other. The instinct for warmth became an instinct for community. Villagers who rarely interacted opened their doors to one another. Entire families shared one cottage. Children slept piled together like puppies. Elders were placed in the very center of rooms, surrounded by younger bodies, radiating heat. Fire had failed, but humanity had not. In dozens of villages across Europe, a new idea began to form, one that would soon reshape the way people slept, lived, and organized their homes. If fire couldn't keep them alive, maybe something else could. And in the next chapter, we explore the sleeping revolution born from that desperate night. The accidental discovery that changed medieval survival forever. By dawn, Europe was shivering. Fires had burned all night, yet homes still felt like caves carved from ice. Families were exhausted, confused, and frightened. But something else had happened too. Something small. Something quiet. Something that would soon transform how medieval people slept for centuries. It started with instinct, not wisdom. In that small river village, after hours of fighting the cold, the farmer and his family had collapsed together near the hearth, all 5 bodies tangled in blankets and wool. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a strategy. They were simply too tired to keep shifting positions or stoking the fire. They pressed together for comfort, and to their shock, the air around them felt noticeably warmer. Not warm like summer. Not warm like a proper fire, but warm enough that their fingers stopped aching. Warm enough that breathing felt easier. And as the mother lay there, half asleep, she noticed something. Whenever one of the children shifted away from the family group, the cold swallowed them instantly. But when they scooted back in, heat returned. This wasn't just shared air. It was shared life, shared warmth, shared survival. At first, people didn't think too deeply about this discovery. They simply clung to it because it worked. But as the frozen night stretched into a frozen week, families across Europe began to imitate it, first by accident, then with purpose. The closeness method is born. In many medieval homes, beds were small and narrow, often meant for 1 or 2 people. Children slept on straw pallets on the floor, servants in corners, elders on wooden benches. But when the cold reached its peak, all those distinctions disappeared. People dragged their beds across the room and shoved them against the hearth. They pushed pallets together. They added layer after layer of straw underneath. They stacked every hide, rug, cloak, and scrap of wool they owned on top. And then they climbed into bed, all of them. A family of 3, a family of 6. Sometimes even 2 neighboring families. People who had never shared a bed before now slept practically on top of each other. The warmth was unmistakable. Each body acted like a furnace, radiating heat that kept the next person alive. It was the earliest form of what we might call group thermoregulation. But medieval villagers didn't have a name for it. To them, it was simply common sense. Still, the discovery spread. The more people in a bed, the warmer it gets. 2. The layering technique. Closer sleeping wasn't enough. people still woke shivering. So they developed a new technique, one that seemed trivial but changed everything: layering the bedding. Before this winter, most peasants used whatever blankets they had, often one or two rough wool pieces that doubled as cloaks during the day. But now they began stacking bedding strategically: straw first cloth, or linen sheet wool blanket, animal skin heavy cloak, another skin. The idea wasn't just weight, it was trapping air. Straw held pockets of warmth. Linen absorbed moisture so wool could insulate better. Hides trapped heat like winter coats. For the first time, ordinary families treated their bedding like a survival tool, not a comfort item. Wealthier households even began sewing together old scraps of fabric into heavy multi-layer quilts, early versions of the medieval patchwork blanket. The cold had forced innovation. 3. The rotation rule. In some regions, a strange habit emerged, one that seems odd today, but made perfect sense at the time. People discovered that the warmest spot in the bed wasn't the edges, but the center. The person in the middle stayed warmest, while those on the outside froze. So families invented a system, rotating positions throughout the night. Old records describe parents gently waking children every hour or two. Move inward, you're cold. Let your sister have the middle now. Trade places so no one freezes. It was a small miracle of cooperation, a medieval choreography of survival. In wallside sleeping. But perhaps the strangest discovery of all came from castle dwellers. In large stone rooms, the wall side of the bed was always colder. The stone sucked warmth away like a sponge. But after the frozen night, people realized something surprising. If two people slept on the wall side together, shoulder to shoulder, they blocked the cold for those sleeping on the outer side of the bed. So they arranged themselves like a heat shield. Two adults or older siblings pressed against the stone wall, younger or weaker family members on the inside, and blankets tucked tightly around the entire group. This human shield sleeping method spread rapidly through towns and countryside alike. 5. The accidental invention of night partners. During that winter, many villagers took in neighbors who lived alone. A widow might stay with a nearby family. A bachelor might sleep in a barn with a group of farmhands. People began pairing up to share heat, sometimes even strangers. The church later encouraged this practice, calling it a Christian act of kindness. Villagers called it simply night partnering, the idea that no one should sleep alone on the coldest nights. What started as a desperate response to a deadly freeze soon became a tradition that lasted generations. The turning point. By the end of the week, people realized something extraordinary. Fire alone wasn't the answer. Heat had to be created together. Villages that embraced group sleeping saw fewer deaths. Families that layered bedding survived longer nights. Even nobles and lords quietly admitted that crowding together in cramped chambers worked better than pacing around vast, cold halls. Human warmth had become the most reliable source of heat in medieval Europe. And this shift, the shift from relying solely on fire to relying on each other, sparked a sleeping revolution that would reshape medieval homes, beds, customs, and even laws. Because once the cold forced people to sleep together, the rules of medieval life began to change. And in the next chapter, you'll see how medieval beds transformed into tools of survival, leading to some of the strangest sleeping habits ever recorded. By the time winter tightened its grip on Europe, beds were no longer simple furniture. They became weapons, the front line of defense in the battle against the cold. Medieval people had slept in many ways before this crisis. Some slept on simple straw pallets, some on creaky wooden frames stuffed with hay. Wealthier families had rope beds that sagged in the middle, needing to be tightened every few weeks. But no matter how rich or poor you were, your bed had always been a place of rest. Now, it was a place of strategy. The frozen night had changed everything. It forced people to rethink not only where they slept, but how they slept, and who they slept with. The bed, once a private space, was about to become the most crowded place in the entire home. 1. Sleeping together wasn't optional. Any more families began treating their beds like lifeboats. You didn't leave anyone out, not even distant cousins, travelers, servants, or neighbors. A widow could end up sharing a blanket with her sister-in-law's family. Even monks, known for strict routines, abandoned solitary cells to pile together in shared dormitories. One monk wrote in his winter journal, "We slept as brothers in the same bed, 10 of us, for warmth. A strange closeness grew between us, half necessity, half companionship. This wasn't scandalous, it wasn't inappropriate, it was survival. The medieval world, so obsessed with hierarchy and status, suddenly flattened inside the bedroom. A person wasn't your lord or a servant anymore. They were simply a warm body trying to live until morning." 2. The strange art of bed arranging. Imagine a medieval bed now, blankets stacked high, animal skins laid across the top, people huddled in tight circles or lined up like sardines, children squeezed in the middle, the safest, warmest spot. But it wasn't just random positioning. Medieval families developed arrangements, formations, rules. Some families slept back to back to create a wall of heat. Others slept belly to belly for the strongest warmth. Large families invented the ring formation, everyone facing inward, feet touching in the center like spokes on a wheel. Certain rules were universal. The eldest slept near the wall. Not out of disrespect, but because elders had the thickest clothing and could handle the cold best. The youngest stayed in the middle. Babies and toddlers had the weakest circulation, so adults formed a protective layer around them. Partners sometimes split apart. 3. Straw. The unsung hero of winter. Straw was cheap, scratchy, and everywhere. Fields, barns, stables. But after the frozen night, straw became a critical part of insulation. Medieval people realized something important. Straw traps air. Air traps heat. Heat means life. So they stuffed beds deeper, much deeper than before. They added layers of straw under blankets and sometimes even over them. Some families slept almost buried in straw like winter animals. 4. The role of animals in the bed. It might sound strange today, but for medieval people, animals inside the bedroom were a blessing. In desperate regions, families even brought lambs, goats, or chickens into bed with them. The warmth was astonishing. A dog could raise the bed's temperature by several degrees. Chickens generated enough heat to stop blankets from freezing. Some families kept piglets indoors during winter, wrapping them in cloth and placing them near sleeping children. The pig's body heat was strong, steady, and incredibly effective. A Yorkshire farmer wrote, "Our pig kept us alive when the wind turned against us." Animals didn't just help physically, they gave comfort. In a world where cold felt like a creeping death, the steady breathing of a dog or the soft warmth of a lamb brought a rare feeling of safety. 5. Privacy disappeared overnight. Before the crisis, privacy was limited, but still valued. Married couples had separate beds from their children. Servants slept apart. Guests had designated areas. But when the cold swept through Europe, privacy evaporated. Curtains around beds stopped being for modesty. They became insulation walls. Families hung extra cloth around the bed frame, turning it into a cocoon. The smaller the enclosed space, the better it trapped body heat. Soon people built makeshift canopy beds out of whatever they had. Old cloaks, sacks, spare linens. Even nobles redesigned their chambers, pulling beds closer to each other, hanging massive drapes, and stuffing gaps with wool. Everyone slept together. Everyone heard each other breathe. The shared bed became the beating heart of the home, pulsing with warmth and life. But the cost was clear. Private life faded. 6. The beginning of bed hierarchies. As the winter dragged on, medieval communities began formalizing their sleep arrangements. Certain people were given priority in the warmest positions: infants, the sick pregnant women, the elderly essential workers, like millers or blacksmiths. This wasn't about favoritism, it was about survival of the whole village. A blacksmith with frozen hands couldn't work. A miller too cold to operate the mill meant no grain. A midwife too weak from cold might lose a mother in labor. Sleeping spots became strategic village assets. And with that realization came something entirely new. Early communal rules, winter sleeping laws. By the time Europe staggered out of the frozen week, something profound had happened. People weren't just changing how they slept, they were changing how they lived. The crisis had revealed a terrifying truth. Individual decisions could no longer guarantee survival. Warmth wasn't a personal matter anymore, it was a community responsibility. And as soon as leaders, lords, priests, elders, guild masters realized this, they began writing rules. Unofficial at first, whispered among households, then formalized through custom, and eventually etched into the rhythm of medieval life. These were the winter laws, a patchwork of strange, clever, sometimes strict rules that reshaped Europe long after the ice thawed. 1. The rule of shared heat. It started with a simple idea. No one sleeps alone in dangerous cold. Before the frozen night, sleeping arrangements were personal boundaries. Even the poorest families tried to maintain some privacy. But after the crisis, villages observed something undeniable. The people who slept alone were the ones who didn't survive. So councils issued a new rule. Widows must be offered a sleeping place in a neighbor's home. Travelers could request shelter from any household by reciting a simple phrase, for warmth and grace. Elders could not be left to sleep in isolated corners of the house. Even manors adopted this code. Chronicles describe nights when entire staffs, maids, stable boys, cooks, and noble families slept in the great hall together like one enormous household. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Warmth became a communal duty, and refusing someone a place near your hearth became as serious as refusing food. Imu 2. Curfews and the night watch of warmth. Winter curfews existed before, but now they took on a new intensity. Towns rang bells at sundown during extreme cold, signaling that everyone must be indoors. But more surprising was the rise of the night warmth watch. Small towns chose 2 or 3 men to walk the streets with torches, lanterns, or even horns. Their job wasn't to enforce order. It was to check for freezing stragglers. If they found someone shaking or weak, they didn't ask questions. They brought them inside the nearest home, where the family was required, by law or custom, to share heat. Some villages passed a rule called the hearth oath. Every household must keep a corner of their home ready for an unexpected guest during severe cold. It was one of the earliest forms of community emergency planning, and it was born from sheer necessity. 3. The firewood codes. Firewood had always been precious. But after the frozen night, wood was treated almost like currency. Local lords and councils realized that private hoarding threatened everyone. If one household ran out, the burden fell on neighbors. If too many people chopped down the same forest, spring growth was ruined. So they created the firewood codes, a set of rules so important that scribes recorded them in manor rolls, parish orders, and town guild books. These codes stated, each household must contribute a portion of wood to the village emergency pile, stored in a central barn. No one could take wood from the emergency pile without permission from the reeve or elder. Fines were issued for cutting down too many trees in winter months. Communal chopping days became mandatory, where the entire village worked together. Even nobles were subject to these rules, at least symbolically. Wealthy households were required to donate far more wood than they used, ensuring the common supply was stable. Winter taught medieval people something essential. A fire kept burning in one house could determine the fate of many. 4. The church steps in. The church had immense power in medieval Europe, and during the frozen night, its role only grew. Parish priests saw the suffering firsthand. They saw babies shivering in their mothers' arms, and elders struggling to breathe in the cold. So they issued religious winter customs, blending faith with survival. The sanctuary of warmth churches became official warming stations. On severe nights, bells rang not for prayer, but for gathering. Parishioners brought hay, blankets, and cloaks to build sleeping nests inside the nave. The church became the town's emergency bedroom. The peace of the hearth. A spiritual law declared that any disputes must be set aside during harsh winter nights. If 2 families were feuding, they were still required to sleep in the same hall if needed. Heat required peace. Peace required cooperation. And God, the church taught, demanded both. The blessing of the bed. Some priests even blessed beds before winter began, sprinkling holy water while praying for warmth, health, and unity. These ceremonies reinforced the idea that sleeping together wasn't shameful. It was sacred. 5. New architecture for a new reality. The frozen night forced people to rethink their homes. And over the next decades, rural villages and towns began redesigning their living spaces. A. Central hearth rooms. Smaller inner rooms were built solely for sleeping during winter, rooms where heat could be trapped more easily. B. Low ceilings. Ceilings were lowered in many cottages to prevent heat from rising too far above sleeping bodies. C. Bed boxes. People began constructing enclosed beds, wooden frames with doors that shut like cabinets. These bed boxes trapped warm air so effectively that they became popular across Scandinavia, France, and the Low Countries. D. Insulated walls. Moss, straw, clay, and even old clothing were stuffed into walls to seal cracks. These makeshift insulators were crude, but they made homes measurably warmer. The medieval home itself had begun to evolve. 6. Social customs born from the cold. As winters remained harsh during the early Little Ice Age, new customs spread. The first guest handed a blanket, not a drink. Warm circles formed during evening storytelling, where bodies sat tightly packed. Weddings held in winter required warm communal feasts, not grand ceremonies. Children were taught winter etiquette, like where to sit during gatherings and how to share warmth politely. A whole culture grew around the understanding that survival came from unity. The turning point before the legacy. By the end of this era, one idea had taken root. Cold was no longer an individual enemy. It was a collective one. The frozen night had sparked new laws, new customs, new architecture, and new ways of thinking. Medieval society had rewired itself to protect the people who lived within it. But the biggest change was yet to come. How all of these adaptations shaped the world long after the crisis ended. Because in the next chapter, you'll see how the frozen night didn't just change medieval life. It reshaped the future of sleep, home design, and even modern comfort. Long after the frozen week passed into legend, Europe continued to walk in its shadow. People didn't talk about the terror anymore, not openly. They didn't dwell on what it felt like to wake with numb fingers, or to hear a neighbor's last breath carried on winter wind. The memory was too raw, too close. But the effects stayed. They leaked quietly into daily life, into traditions, into architecture, into the very rhythm of how people slept and lived. Centuries later, historians look back and see an undeniable line connecting that one brutal winter to the developments that followed. People didn't just survive the frozen night, they changed because of it, and they passed those changes on. This chapter is about those echoes, the ways the crisis sculpted a different Europe. 1. The birth of the winter household. Before the frozen night, homes reorganized seasonally. Families followed the sun and fields, not the cold. But afterward, people across Europe began preparing for winter like a military campaign. A. The autumn gatherings. Every autumn, villages held what became known as the warmth count. Not an official census, more like a survival inventory. Families gathered in the town square with lists. Who lived in their household, who might need shelter, who was too old or too young to withstand winter alone. It was a quiet rehearsal for disaster, meant to prevent a repeat of the night no one wanted to remember. B. The hearth families. Another strange custom emerged. Seasonal family merging. If two small households struggled with wood or labor shortages, they combined for the winter. Two homes became one winter household. They ate together, slept together, worked together, then split again in spring. It wasn't about liking each other. 2. The evolution of beds and sleep. One of the most surprising long-term changes happened in the bedroom. Though medieval people wouldn't have recognized that word. They didn't have bedrooms the way we do. But because of the frozen night, the idea of warm, enclosed, private sleeping spaces began to take shape. A. The enclosed bed becomes standard. The bed box, born out of necessity during the crisis, slowly became a household status symbol. Wealthy families carved ornate wooden doors for them. Poor families hammered them together from scrap planks. The benefits were so obvious that within 2 centuries, bed boxes spread across France, Germany, Scotland, and Scandinavia. B. Wool, not linen. Before the frozen week, Linen sheets were the pride of many households. But linen was terrible in cold. It trapped dampness, froze easily, and provided little insulation. Afterward, wool became the winter standard. C. Layered sleeping rituals. Medieval sleep evolved into a highly ritualized process, warming stones placed at the foot of the bed, hot water poured into clay jars for hand warmers, wool socks worn to bed, 2 or 3 layers of blankets arranged systematically. These habits became cultural norms long after the original crisis faded from memory. 3. Winter food, the new diet of survival. Before the frozen night, winter diets were simple: grains, root vegetables, and whatever could be preserved. Afterward, food preparation became almost scientific. A. High-fat winter meals. Communities discovered something crucial. Those who survived the frozen week tended to have more body fat. They simply withstood cold longer. So winter diets shifted toward cheeses, cured meats, animal fats, thick stews. B. Winter ale brewers responded too. New recipes produced stronger, darker ales designed to warm the body. Some monasteries produced hospital ales specifically for widows and the poor during winter months. C. Shared winter kitchens. Villages started building communal ovens where families could warm themselves while baking bread. The kitchen was already the warmest room in most homes, but the frozen week transformed ovens into nighttime gathering places. 4. Community warmth rituals become tradition. One of the most powerful cultural shifts came from rituals meant to preserve heat. A. The midwinter circle. In many regions, families gathered each night in a literal warm circle, sitting shoulder to shoulder near the hearth. Elders passed stories, children shared tasks, and the fire was fed steadily. B. The blessing of wood. Some towns developed a ritual where the first log of winter was brought to the church to be blessed before burning. This log symbolized strength, hope, and communal unity. C. Night of many candles. A custom emerged in which neighbors placed candles in their windows during the coldest nights. It was a signal to travelers. 5. Winter architecture grows more sophisticated. By the 15th century, architecture itself had shifted. A. Thicker walls. Builders doubled wall thickness using wattle, daub, or stone to retain heat. B. Smaller windows. Because glass was expensive and drafty, medieval windows shrank dramatically, some barely larger than arrow slits. C. Loft sleeping. Families began building lofts above kitchens and hearths so heat could rise into sleeping spaces. This became especially common in colder regions. 6. The echo that reached modern times. Centuries later, when Europe industrialized, few people remembered the frozen week itself. But the customs remained embedded in culture. Sleeping with heavy blankets, wool clothing as winter necessity, strong winter ales, thick-walled cottages sharing heat in families, winter storytelling rituals. The idea that no one should sleep alone in extreme cold, even modern heating systems were designed around an ancient assumption that warmth should be centralized, shared, and constant. The frozen night left Europe with more than grief.